Hello friends, this is my true story, so watch till end. My name is Robert Murphy. I am 68 years old, and for most of my life, I fixed things that other people never thought about until they broke. Railroad tracks, switches buried under snow, steel joints that screamed when winter tightened its grip. I spent 42 years as a railroad maintenance technician, working nights that blurred into mornings, winters that gnawed at my bones, summers that rang in my ears long after the machine shut down. It was honest work, loud work, the kind that bends your spine and teaches you how to keep going even when no one is watching. And every year, every double shift, every frozen mile of steel had one quiet purpose. A place where the world would finally leave me alone. I didn't talk about it much. Dreams like that feel fragile when you say them out loud. But on the nights when the house was quiet and sleep refused to come, I imagined a small cabin tucked into trees tall enough to swallow sound. Cold mornings, coffee steaming in my hands, wind instead of engines, silence that didn't demand anything from me. When I finally bought the cabin in northern Wisconsin, it felt less like a purchase and more like a reward I had postponed my entire life. The first time I unlocked the door, the smell of fresh stain and raw wood wrapped around me. The floor groaned softly beneath my boots, a familiar sound that reminded me of old rail cars settling under weight. Even the imperfections felt right. The walls weren't trying to impress anyone. They were sturdy, patient, built to last, just like the life that paid for them. That first night, I slept deeper than I had in years. In the morning, I woke to wind threading its way through birch and pine. It wasn't loud. It didn't rush. It moved like it had nowhere else to be. The air carried a clean, sharp bite that filled my lungs and settled my thoughts. When I stepped onto the porch, the light was just beginning to spread across the clearing, slow and deliberate, as if the sun itself understood that this place wasn't meant to be rushed. For a moment, I felt younger, not in the way people talk about nostalgia, but in the way your body remembers what it feels like to be steady, capable, enough. I stood there thinking about kneeling beside frozen tracks at 3 in the morning, fingers numb, breath fogging my goggles. About missed holidays. About choosing responsibility over rest so many times it stopped feeling like a choice. All of it led here. This quiet, this small square of land that belonged to no one but me. Later that afternoon, I called my daughter Ruby. Her voice came through warm and bright, like she had stepped into the cabin with me instead of answering from miles away. She told me she was proud of me, said it made her happy to know I'd finally done something just for myself. When she said that, I felt a soft pull in my chest, the kind that comes when someone sees the parts of you that never asked for applause. I told her she could visit any time, that we'd drink coffee on the porch and watch deer wander through the trees like they own the place. She laughed, the way she does when she lets herself believe that life might actually slow down if you ask it nicely. That call made the cabin feel like home. The second call did the opposite. It came after sunset, when the woods had gone dark and the wind pressed gently against the windows. The screen lit up with Damon's name, my son-in-law. His voice was flat from the first word, stripped of warmth, stripped of question. He told me his parents, Howard and Denise, would be moving into my cabin. He didn't ask. He called it a temporary solution, said they needed space more than I did, that it would be easier for everyone if I just moved back to the city. As if this place I had worked for decades for was a spare room I wasn't using correctly. I opened my mouth to respond, but he kept talking, stacking decisions on top of decisions, each one closing the space where my voice should have been. By the time the call ended, there was nothing left to say that wouldn't turn into an argument, and I had spent too many years fixing broken things to pretend shouting ever repaired anything. So I stood there in silence. The cabin felt different with no sound in it. Outside, the forest deepened into shadow, and the wind pressed harder against the glass, like it was trying to warn me of something I wasn't ready to hear. I felt a shift inside my chest, subtle but unmistakable, the sense that the peace I had just claimed was already being measured, negotiated, and pulled apart by people who hadn't earned a single inch of it. The pressure didn't wait. The next morning, I was drinking coffee on the porch when my phone buzzed. Damon had sent a list. Not suggestions, requirements. new linens, different cookware, a larger television, a second refrigerator, because his parents liked to keep certain foods separate. He wrote as if the cabin already belonged to them, as if my presence was a logistical inconvenience that needed adjusting. At the bottom of the message, almost casually, he mentioned they'd be taking the master bedroom. He suggested I move into the smaller room, or sleep on the porch sofa if I wanted more space. I stared at the screen until the coffee went cold. I didn't respond. There was something about the message that made answering feel pointless. It wasn't conversation. It was a declaration. Later that afternoon, Ruby called again. Her voice was different this time. Careful, measured, like someone walking across ice they didn't fully trust. When I asked what was wrong, she hesitated. Then she told me Damon had been talking to relatives, telling them he was worried about me, saying I shouldn't be alone in the woods, that I was lonely, forgetful, that I might not be taking care of myself properly. She asked if I was eating well. The question hurt more than the accusation, because I could hear the concern underneath it, and I knew that concern hadn't started with her. It had been planted, watered, and shaped into something that sounded reasonable enough to repeat. I told her the truth, that I was fine, that the cabin brought me peace, that I had never felt more clear-headed in my life. She went quiet, not angry, not convinced, just suspended between what she knew of me and what she was being told by the man she trusted. When the call ended, I sat alone at the kitchen table, listening to the clock tick, feeling something fragile begin to crack. A few days later, Howard and Denise arrived unannounced. They walked through the door without knocking, slow and deliberate, like inspectors evaluating a property they already believed was theirs. Howard tapped the wall and said it needed repainting. Denise wrinkled her nose at the kitchen and asked why I hadn't bought something more suitable for a family. Their tone wasn't hostile. It was worse. It was the voice people use when they assume the person in front of them can't keep up. They talked over me, discussed rearranging the living room to get the best view, spoke about storage and furniture placement, as if I were a temporary obstacle rather than the owner of the land beneath their feet. I nodded. I listened. I kept my voice level and polite, even as something inside me tightened with every word. When they finally left, the cabin felt smaller. That night, I pulled out an old notebook from my work years. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed, but the habit came back instantly. On job sites, documentation kept you alive. Dates, details, conversations. Facts had weight when memory was questioned. I wrote everything down. Calls, messages, names, what was said, how it was said. My hand cramped before my thoughts slowed. And as the pages filled, something else happened. Clarity. Emotion gave way to structure. Hurt sharpened into awareness. This wasn't something I could meet with feelings alone. It needed planning. It needed patience. And as I closed the notebook and listened to the woods settle around the cabin, one thought refused to leave me. When did the life I earned become something other people felt entitled to take? The morning after I filled that notebook, I woke before sunrise, not because I was anxious, but because my mind had already shifted in motion. Years on the railroad taught me something most people never learn. When pressure starts building quietly, you don't wait for the explosion. You trace the stress points. You watch who's tightening the bolts and who's pretending the noise isn't coming from them. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and reread every word I had written. The pattern was there, clear as steel under fresh snow. Damon wasn't acting alone, but he was directing the current. His parents needed space, money, relief from consequences they had spent years dodging. And Damon needed control, control that looked like responsibility from the outside. By mid-morning, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Damon. This one was softer in tone, but heavier in implication. He said he'd been thinking a lot about my situation. Said he worried the isolation might be getting to me. Mentioned that Howard and Denise would feel safer if I wasn't alone out there. He closed by saying this arrangement was for my own good. That phrase stayed with me. For my own good. It's a dangerous thing to say to someone when you've already decided they don't get a vote. Ruby called that afternoon. She asked questions that sounded rehearsed. Whether I remembered what day it was. If I'd been paying my bills on time. if I'd noticed myself repeating stories. Each question landed carefully, like she was afraid to break something fragile, but the damage was already happening. I answered calmly, truthfully. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I told her what my days looked like. How I woke early, cooked, read, took walks through the trees. How my mind felt clearer than it had in years. When I mentioned the notebook, the documenting habit from my work days, she paused. Why would you need to do that? She asked. I didn't answer right away. I was trying to decide whether honesty would help or harm. In the end, I told her I liked having things written down, that it made me feel organized, prepared. She said she understood, but her voice carried doubt. Not her own, but borrowed. Passed along. After the call, I sat on the porch and watched the trees sway. The woods were calm, indifferent to human drama. They didn't care who owned what, who owed whom. They simply existed. And for the first time since buying the cabin, I felt something other than peace settle in my chest. I felt watched, not by eyes, but by narratives forming somewhere I couldn't see. A few days later, Damon showed up in person. He didn't come alone. Howard and Denise followed him in, already talking about timelines and moving trucks. Damon stood near the doorway, arms crossed, wearing the expression of a man who believed he was being patient with someone difficult. He said we needed to talk. He told me he'd been researching elder care options, that he'd spoken to people who said it wasn't safe for someone my age to live so far from town. He framed every sentence as concern, but none of them asked what I wanted. When I told him I was healthy, capable, and not interested in leaving my home, his jaw tightened. He said I was being stubborn, that I didn't understand how worried everyone was. That refusing help was a sign in itself. Howard chimed in, saying it would be easier if I just let the family handle things. Denise added that stress wasn't good for someone my age. I listened. I watched. And somewhere between their words, I realized something essential. They weren't trying to help me. They were trying to reposition me. From owner to obstacle. From father to liability. From man to problem. When I didn't agree, Damon's voice hardened. He said he might have to make some calls. Talk to people who could step in if I couldn't make reasonable decisions. That was the moment the air changed. I felt it in my chest, the way you feel when machinery shifts pitch just before something fails. I told them the conversation was over, that this was my home and my decision, that they were welcome to leave. They did, but not before Damon looked at me and said, I hope you don't make this harder than it needs to be. The following week was quieter on the surface. No visits, fewer calls, but the silence felt engineered. The kind that's meant to make you doubt yourself. I kept writing everything down. Every message, every missed call, every odd phrasing that suggested a story being built without me in the room. That's when I drove into town. The outdoor supply store sat on the edge of the highway, its windows filled with maps and gear meant for people who understood that nature doesn't bend for comfort. I walked the aisles slowly, reading spines, asking questions. I didn't rush. I didn't explain more than necessary. The clerk talked about local wildlife, about wolves that passed through the northern stretch of the woods. He assumed I was new and trying to protect my property. I let him assume. I bought motion-activated cameras, sent lures used by hunters, books on animal behavior. When I returned to the cabin, the air was cool and still. I placed the cameras carefully, making sure they faced the clearing and tree line. I used the lures sparingly, far from the house, in areas animals already traveled. Nothing dangerous, nothing illegal, just reality, amplified. Then I locked the cabin and drove back to my old house in the city. From there, I could watch everything unfold without being present. 2 days later, the cameras lit up. Howard and Denise arrived first, stepping out of their car with irritation written all over their faces. They complained about the cold, about the distance, about how inconvenient everything was. Damon followed behind them, already frustrated. They were halfway across the clearing when movement appeared at the edge of the frame. 3 wolves. They didn't rush. They didn't threaten. They stood at a distance, drawn by the scent, curious and alert. But that was enough. Howard froze. Denise screamed. Damon shouted for them to get back to the car. Panic took over. They ran, stumbling over uneven ground, slamming doors, speeding away in a cloud of dust. I watched it all from my phone, heart steady. An hour later, Damon called. He was furious. Accused me of creating a dangerous situation. Said I was irresponsible, reckless, that I had put lives at risk. I let him speak. Then I reminded him calmly that the woods belong to wildlife, that anyone living there needs to understand that reality, that nothing I had done was illegal or unexpected for the area. He hung up on me. That night, I stood in my old living room, looking out at a street filled with light and noise, and felt something shift again, stronger this time. This wasn't about a cabin anymore. This was about control, and Damon was losing his grip. The fallout came fast. Calls from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Messages filled with concern that didn't sound like their own words. They asked if I was confused, if I was scared, if I needed help managing things. Ruby called late one evening, her voice tight. She repeated things she'd been told, asked if I'd been forgetting dates, mixing things up. I answered calmly, but inside, something heavy settled. Hearing doubt in my daughter's voice hurt more than any accusation Damon had thrown at me. Because this wasn't about winning an argument. It was about losing trust. 2 mornings later, there was a knock at my door. A woman from Adult Protective Services introduced herself. She said they'd received a complaint about my well-being. I stepped aside and let her in. I showed her the cabin, the organized countertops, the stock pantry, the labeled folders. I handed her my recent medical exam results, clean health, strong cognitive scores. I answered her questions without defensiveness. As she listened, her expression shifted. She told me the complaint appeared unfounded, that situations like this often happen when someone is trying to control an elder family member. She said my case would be marked as such. After she left, I sat at the table with my notebook open and understood something fully for the first time. This wasn't just pressure. It was a strategy. And if I didn't meet it with equal clarity and restraint, I would lose far more than a cabin. I needed someone who understood the rules Damon was trying to bend. And I knew exactly where to look. The name Linda Carver came to me the same way most solid solutions do. Quietly, through someone who didn't exaggerate. An elder law attorney, early 60s, sharp, methodical, and known for not mistaking family pressure for good intentions. I called her that afternoon. Her office sat in a modest brick building with windows that didn't try to impress anyone. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and coffee that had been reheated one too many times. She shook my hand firmly and listened without interrupting as I laid my notebook on the desk between us. I didn't dramatize anything. I didn't need to. Dates, messages, calls, footage, patterns. I let the facts speak in the same calm order they always had on the job site. Linda read carefully, flipping pages, pausing now and then to underline a line or circle a name. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. What your son-in-law is doing, she said, isn't about concern. It's about narrative. She explained it plainly. If someone could convince enough people that I was confused or incapable, decisions could be taken out of my hands. Assets questioned. Ownership challenged. Control transferred under the language of protection. She didn't say it to scare me. She said it because she'd seen it before. Her recommendation was simple and heavy at the same time. A revocable living trust. A neutral trustee. Clear documentation that my assets, including the cabin and my savings, were protected and would pass directly to Ruby without interference. I felt something loosen in my chest as she spoke. Not relief exactly, but grounding. The sense that I was no longer standing alone in the dark. We set the wheels in motion immediately. Before I left, Linda asked if she could look into something else. Public records, financial filings connected to Damon's family. I agreed, not expecting much. Debt is common. Trouble hides easily in paperwork. 3 days later, she called and asked me to come back. This time, her office felt colder. She placed a folder on the desk and told me Howard and Denise had been carrying significant debt for years. Loans rolled into loans. Payments missed and deferred. Nothing criminal, but nothing stable either. Then she placed another file on top of the first. This, she said carefully, is what concerns me most. The documents showed a loan taken out using Ruby's name and their home as collateral. A loan Damon had secured without telling her. The mortgage was months behind. A foreclosure notice had already been filed. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My daughter's home, the place she had built her life, her routines, her sense of safety, was hanging by a thread she didn't even know existed. I stared at the papers until the words blurred, until the room felt too small to hold what I was seeing. Linda asked if I wanted to confront Ruby with the information. I shook my head. I knew Damon. I knew how quickly he could turn truth into accusation, concern into conflict. If Ruby heard this without proof, without structure, she might think I was attacking her marriage out of bitterness. I wouldn't do that to her. I stood by the window and watched cars pass, each one carrying someone who had no idea how completely my world had shifted in the last 5 minutes. Linda explained the options. The bank would likely sell the debt soon. They wanted it off their books. I could purchase it through an anonymous LLC. Stop the foreclosure. Protect Ruby without dragging her into the fight before she was ready. The idea sat heavy in my chest. It wasn't how I imagined using my savings. But then again, I hadn't imagined needing to protect my own child from the man she married. As I left her office, the evening air felt sharp against my face. I understood then that this wasn't retaliation. This was guardianship. The paperwork moved quickly. By the time Ruby arrived at the cabin that Saturday morning, everything was laid out on the kitchen table. Foreclosure notices, loan documents, records of missed payments. Nothing hidden, nothing softened. She walked in with a tight smile, the kind people were when they know something is wrong but hope it's manageable. She looked at the table, then at me, waiting for reassurance I couldn't give. We have to start with the truth, I told her. She sat down slowly. I guided her through each document, letting her read every line herself. I didn't summarize. I didn't interpret. I let reality do what it always does when it's finally allowed into the room. At first, she shook her head. So there had to be a mistake. That Damon would never hide something this serious. Her voice wavered between disbelief and defense. Then she saw the signature. Something in her face changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, but completely. The denial didn't shatter. It dissolved. She went very still, breathing shallow, as if her body needed time to catch up with what her eyes had already accepted. When the truth finally settled, she pressed her hand to her mouth. I had seen that gesture before, years ago, when she was a child and learned that something precious couldn't be fixed. She asked who held the debt now. I told her. I explained the LLC. The foreclosure stopped. The reason. I told her I hadn't done it to control her, but to give her space to choose without a clock counting down over her head. She looked at me with confusion and hurt tangled together. Rescue can feel like intrusion when it arrives without warning. I understood that. I told her she had a choice. If she chose to leave Damon and protect herself, I would erase the debt and secure her stability. If she chose to stay, things would be harder, but I wouldn't interfere. This wasn't about forcing her hand. It was about giving her one back. She said she needed time. I nodded. Some truths need room to breathe. Damon arrived later that afternoon. He came in already angry, his words spilling over each other. Accused me of manipulation, of poisoning Ruby against him, of crossing lines no father should cross. I didn't interrupt him. As he spoke, something unexpected surfaced beneath the anger. Fear, pressure, a lifetime of trying to be enough for parents who never stopped needing rescue. He admitted, without meaning to, that he had been covering Howard and Denise's debts for years, that the loan had felt like the only option left. For a brief moment, I saw a man cornered by expectations he never learned to refuse. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but explained the panic. Ruby stepped between us. Her voice was calm when she said she was done, that she needed space, that she couldn't live in a house built on secrets and fear. Damon went quiet, not because he understood, but because there was no argument left that could bring her back. He left without looking at either of us. 2 days later, Ruby began the process of separation. Within a month, she filed for divorce. When the paperwork was signed, I contacted Linda and cleared the remaining debt tied to her home. Stability isn't something you negotiate with. It's something you build and protect. By early autumn, Ruby moved into a small house near the woods, 15 minutes from my cabin. She returned to teaching full-time, found comfort in routine again. We started having Sunday dinners, sometimes at her place, sometimes on my porch. One evening, as the light faded behind the trees and the air cooled, she leaned back in her chair with a kind of peace I hadn't seen in years. And as the woods settled into silence around us, I realized something with absolute clarity. Fighting back had never been about revenge. It was about dignity, about protecting the person I loved most, even when it meant letting go of the illusions I once held about family, loyalty, and the cost of looking the other way. The quiet had returned. This time, it stayed. The quiet after everything settles is never the same as the quiet you imagined in the beginning. When Ruby moved into her new place near the woods, the house was small and plain, the kind of place that didn't try to impress anyone. Sunlight reached the kitchen in the morning. The floors creaked in familiar ways. There was nothing excessive, nothing borrowed, nothing built on promises that required maintenance. It fit her in a way the old house never truly had. I helped her carry boxes up the steps on a cool autumn afternoon. Leaves scraped softly across the driveway, and the air smelled like change, clean, sharp, unavoidable. She worked quietly, focused, as if movement itself was helping her sort through thoughts she wasn't ready to say out loud. I didn't push. Some lessons need silence to finish teaching themselves. In the weeks that followed, Ruby settled into routine again, teaching full-time, waking early, coming home tired but steady. The version of her that returned wasn't lighter, just clearer. Grief doesn't vanish when truth arrives. It simply loses its confusion. Damon tried to call once. I didn't answer. He sent a message instead, short, controlled, stripped of the anger that once drove it. He said he wanted to explain himself, that he hadn't meant for things to go so far, that he'd been under pressure. I read the message once and placed the phone face down on the table. Explanation doesn't undo impact, and pressure, no matter how heavy, doesn't justify deception. Howard and Denise disappeared from our lives entirely. No calls, no demands, no sudden concern about my well-being. Their silence confirmed what their presence never had. This was never about family. It was about access. Linda finalized the trust before winter set in. Every detail documented, every asset protected. A neutral trustee, clear instructions, no ambiguity left to exploit. She explained it wasn't about cutting people out. It was about removing opportunities for control. I signed the papers with a steady hand, not out of bitterness, out of clarity. Winter arrived early that year. Snow crept into the woods in careful layers, muting sound, slowing everything down. The cabin returned to itself. Each morning, I shoveled the porch, brewed coffee, watched steam rise against the cold. The wolves never returned to the clearing, but their presence lingered in memory, not as threat, but as reminder. Nature doesn't negotiate. It simply responds to what you place in its path. Ruby came over most Sundays. Sometimes we cooked. Sometimes we sat in silence. Sometimes we talked about things that had nothing to do with the past. And sometimes, rarely, we acknowledged what had been lost. One evening, as dusk folded itself into the trees, she told me she felt embarrassed for not seeing it sooner, for defending Damon, for questioning me. I told her the truth. That trust isn't a weakness. That love often blinds us to things we aren't ready to face. That the only real mistake is refusing to look once the evidence is clear. She nodded, eyes fixed on the darkening woods. I don't think he ever meant to hurt me, she said quietly. I know, I replied. Intent matters in understanding, but it doesn't erase consequence. As the months passed, the story others had told about me faded. No more concern calls. No more careful questions. The narrative Damon tried to build collapsed under the weight of documented reality. People lose interest when there's no drama left to feed. And that was fine with me. I didn't need apologies. I needed peace. One late afternoon, as winter loosened its grip and the first signs of spring pressed through the soil, I stood on the porch and realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Damon. Not at his parents. Not even at myself. Anger requires energy. And energy, at this stage of life, is better spent protecting what remains than resenting what's gone. I thought back to that first morning in the cabin, the wind through the trees, the sense that I had finally arrived somewhere meant just for me. I had been right about the place, but wrong about the timing. Peace isn't something you purchase. It's something you defend. And sometimes, defending it costs you the illusion that family will always choose love over control, honesty over convenience, dignity over access. But illusions are lighter to carry once you put them down. On one of our final evenings before the ground fully thawed, Ruby and I sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching the last of the snow melt into the soil. The woods were quiet, not empty, but resting. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. "I feel safe again," she said. Those words settled into me deeper than anything else that had happened. In the end, I didn't win anything. I reclaimed it. My voice, my home, my right to choose how my life would be lived and how my love would be given. The cabin still creaks at night. The wind still moves through birch and pine. The world hasn't become kinder, but it has become clearer. And that, I've learned, is worth more than silence alone. Because the quiet you earn through dignity doesn't disappear the moment someone decides they want it for themselves. Silence didn't come back the way I first imagined it would. It didn't arrive as an empty reward or a perfect ending. It returned heavier, earned through choices that hurt, truths that cut, and boundaries that refused to bend. I learned something standing on that porch, watching the woods breathe around me. Peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's what remains after you stop letting others rewrite your worth in the language of concern. Some betrayals don't shout. They whisper. They smile. They call themselves family. And sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do isn't to forgive quickly or stay quiet longer, but to stand still and say, "This is where it ends." The cabin still stands. The trees still listen. And the quiet I live in now doesn't belong to anyone else's expectations. It belongs to the life I defended.